On the surface, Pentiment is a game about solving a series of murders that occur in a small town during the 16th century. In reality, Pentiment is not about these murders at all. It's about great and terrible people, depression, friendships, life, death, and faith. And it all combines to make one of the most relatable and emotional games I have ever played. It's a game that I love that can be misunderstood easily, and I believe that Pentiment has much to teach other video games despite it having a few faults. And when I say that Pentiment has much to teach, I'm not talking about its core gameplay. It's extremely simple, and I think some people won't like it. It's walking around and talking to people. The game part is making choices by dialogue or what you choose to investigate, and then you suffer the consequences of your actions, sometimes hilariously. There's also the occasional minigame, but as far as mechanics goes, dodging, parrying, rolling, and attacking are nowhere to be found. In fact, in a game about walking, there's not even a run button. But please don't let that turn you off of this game if you haven't played it and are even remotely interested, because the super simple gameplay that it does have works in tandem with the game's main themes. These gameplay and story moments ultimately reveal a more unique aspect that most people will never give it credit for, and it's an aspect that most games don't even have. And that's how real, relatable, and honest the characters in this game can be. Basically, Pentiment's characters and story are incredible, mostly because it also has some issues that are impossible to ignore. What's funny is that the murder mystery part of this mostly incredible story is not that good. In fact, it's the weakest link of the entire game. It's funny because this mystery is what the game stands on. You'll find it advertised in trailers and store pages. It's what keeps the plot moving forward, and it's what motivates our main character. But the murders that occur are unsatisfying and mostly inconclusive. For most of the game, there isn't always a right answer that you'll be able to find. And yet, this flawed mystery not only mirrors the game's other themes, it ultimately strengthens them. And if you dislike this game purely because the mystery is, in a traditional sense, a poor mystery, you have missed the point of this entire game. I have talked as much as I can about the game without spoiling it, but I can't make this video unless I talk in detail about what happens in Pentiment. So far, I have been speaking in generalizations that you can hear in almost any review, but it's time to dive a bit deeper. I'm going to walk through almost every big event that happens and how they tie into my favorite themes. I think it is very important that you go in blind if you want to play this game properly. So if you haven't played and want to, please play it and come back. Anyways, spoiler warning over, let's talk about why Pentiment's story is so emotionally compelling and how it could have been even better. Pentiment starts with a dream of an artist that lives in a small town called Tassing. It's a dream that features different aspects of our main character, Andreas Mahler, represented in his mind by a few different key figures. Socrates represents reason, Beatrice represents virtue, and St. Grobian represents a devilish, foolish side to Andreas. These characters represent Andreas' healthy mind. They're weighing in on a conversation that Andreas had with the abbot of the abbey in Tassing. Andreas has a commission with the abbey, and is here for a limited time before he goes back to Nuremberg. But what's more interesting than Andreas' backstory is the role of these three key figures here. Later during conversations with other characters throughout Act 1, you can think to yourself and choose a part of your mind to weigh in on the current situation. A brash and foolish yet passionate response will be represented by Grobian. The more logical response will be represented by Socrates, and the more virtuous and cautious part will be represented by Beatrice. They all work in tandem and allows Andreas' mind to weigh in on choices that he is about to make, which gives him a hint at the outcome of said choices. It's unique and well done, and beyond simple gameplay mechanics, this little mind place is a cornerstone of how character-focused Pentiment is. Most of the game is shaping Andreas' thoughts and actions, which give him plenty of time to show who he is. We'll return to this dream state in due time, but this sets the stage for an entire game that revolves around one character. After this dream, Andreas walks outside his room to greet the family that is housing him. They ask for an advance on this month's rent. Regardless if you help them or not, the choice is yours to make. Afterwards, you go outside to travel to the abbey for work, and can have conversations with a large amount of people on the way there, experiencing their lives and troubles. Throughout the game, you will constantly encounter people and sometimes their problems. For many, taxes are due. Maybe the sheep got out, and sometimes people die, and not always by murder. And the game occasionally lets you impact their lives by making choices and having them remember your responses. Andreas' character and how he interacts with those around him are the two key pillars of Pentiment's story. If you lack an appreciation for either of these two aspects, you either don't like this game or you're not going to like this game. because as the story progresses, the game's best themes will show in both of these cornerstones. You see, most games have a really weak story. My biggest gripe with video game stories is that the characters have surface level growth. In other words, characters reveal themselves as one-dimensional really fast because the writers don't know how to show believable character growth in a good way. Games that I love are pretty big offenders of this. They'll use an obviously negative personality trait like fear or being naive, and have that character overcome this trait through a set of situations. And then they eventually learn to grow out of said negative personality trait. It can feel pretty formulaic when it's so out in the open for you to see. Good games with good character growth can follow a similar formula, but display such a wide variety of emotions in the character to make it feel a bit more authentic. This leads to showcasing all aspects of what makes them human and flawed, and therefore compelling. Take Joel from both Last of Us games. He's not constantly grumpy at the start of the first game and constantly happy at the end of them. Throughout almost the entirety of both games, he'll go through emotional turmoil. He'll get upset and wall Ellie off. He'll show a softer side when his guard is down. He'll show a violent side when something is threatening him. As time goes on, he makes radically different choices at many different parts of both games. And yet he still sticks to a few core choices, not because he doesn't grow, but because he's stubborn and holding onto something dearly. Because Joel's actions show what he values in a complex way. It's always a reflection of what his priorities are. Similarly to The Last of Us, Pentiment does its characters right, but before we can get into why, we first have to ask how Pentiment actually works. Recall the two core pillars of Pentiment storytelling, Andreas and other characters. Choices play a factor in both of these core pillars. For Andreas, your choices will influence his personality, but despite this, every Andreas goes through the same journey, a rise, a fall, and then a redemption. The most customization you get is backgrounds and professions for your character. These add a personal note to dialogue and allow you to have more authentic conversations related to Andreas's background and history. But while you get to make choices that reflect values of your choosing, there is some core dialogue that never changes. Sometimes your choices will just be variations of the same dialogue choice. We'll get to this when we cover the second act, but it mostly gets away with having poor choice implementation, and Andreas' journey eventually ends up having plenty of depth regardless. Most choices and their impact show up in the second pillar of the game's storytelling, which is the characters around Andreas. These side characters' stories change as you make different decisions regarding their lives. What you say determines a lot of what happens to each individual person. A simple example of this is encouraging a friend to leave town to find the love of his life in Act 2 causes him to get married by Act 3. These small details have no impact on the main story or Andreas' character, but are a key part of understanding this game's biggest strength. There are 3 exceptions to these side characters that you can influence, and that's because their story is told only through the main murder mystery, and we should probably talk about them before we continue on with Andreas' story. These 3 are Piero, Klaus, and Father Thomas. Piero is my favorite character. He's an older monk at the abbey that Andreas works at. He acts as Andreas' mentor and father figure in a limited capacity, and is the antithesis for all the petty squabbling and fights that all the other members of the abbey get into. Throughout this game, so many people treat others poorly because of how selfish they are. Rather than put his pride and identity in himself, he simply wants to live a life of devotion. It contributes to a constant distinction between the humble and the proud that Pentiment often makes. Klaus is also important. He's a printer that is a close friend to Andreas. He's someone that Andreas can lean on, and that's evident for when you have dinner with him, his wife, and his son. He values Andreas' opinion enough to ask for it in his work, and he's a kind enough friend to offer help in any way he can. Overall, he's a great friend in Act 1, and will become even more important as the game goes on. Lastly, Father Thomas is the head of the local church. While he just wants people to be saved, he often goes about it in ways that seem overbearing. He chides Andreas about Mass, and seems to be the stereotypical pastor that just wants people to show up to church. But he'll also be much more important later on. After this short beginning, Andreas is introduced to the inevitable first victim, the Baron. He rides into town wanting to check on a commission that he made with the Abbey. Unfortunately for the Baron, he has a history with a few different members of the town who all have a good reason to kill him. So shockingly, he gets killed. The prime suspect is Piero because he was at the scene of the crime, yet he's fully 100% innocent. This is because it's almost physically impossible for Piero to have done it, and his apprehension is more political than ethical. Somebody has to take the fall for when the news breaks, so it's up to you to find who really did it so that Piero can walk free. So far, this is a standard detective story, but things start to get weird when you suddenly find yourself very limited on time. Time in this game is important. You have a cycle of morning, afternoon, meal, evening, meal, night, and repeat. Use the afternoons and evenings to investigate, meals to interact and meet with characters, and nighttime to go home and sleep. And doing any sort of investigating, eating, or sleeping moves the story, and therefore time, forward. And time is limited. You have a day and a half before you have to present your findings, and you have multiple options for who could have killed the Baron. Even with the shorter time, I was confident I could crack this case. After being kicked out from the scene of the crime, you have a quick meal with Klaus and his family, where you discuss different suspects and possible motives. The suspects are Lucky, the stonesman, Fenric, the prior, Otilia, the widow, and Matilda, a nun. After thanking Klaus's wife and telling his son to be good, my Andreas sets off to catch a murderer. But the more I investigated, the more I realized that there wasn't a definitive right answer to who killed the Baron. Any one of them could have feasibly done it, and you have to choose which one you think is best. It's a bleak scenario, but it's even bleaker that the game never reveals who did it, not even in Act 2 or Act 3. There's no canon choice here, only the fact that someone killed the Baron, and that person is being goaded into it by someone writing really fancy notes. Basically, an anonymous mastermind that knows too much is writing notes in fancy penmanship and delivering them to our suspects. These notes push one of our suspects to murder. I can imagine that there are plenty of people who check out here. After all, what's a murder mystery with no definitive murderer and a lack of time to investigate everything you possibly can? But honestly, I think that the limited time and ambiguous culprit works in the game's favor from both a story and a gameplay perspective. Well, at least for now, but we'll get to that later. I can also understand how the time constraint can feel frustrating. Maybe you investigate someone you thought did it, but after completing your investigation, you are no longer convinced. Maybe you wanted to see who else did it, and due to lost time, there's no way to. But regardless, saving your friend's life is the most important thing to Andreas, and hopefully you, the player. So you are forced into a situation that is uncomfortable by possibly accusing someone without definitive proof. Uncomfortable is a perfect way to describe my feelings when I made such a crucial decision on such limited time. It's why I call this a terrible traditional mystery. If you're in this game for the big reveals, you're going to be disappointed. There are so many loose ends that the murders don't get any closure. These feelings might be annoying or undesirable to some, but what all these mechanics and themes combine to is an understanding of what makes the real world so interesting. Andreas has taken it on himself to investigate this murder because no one else could, and despite good intentions, his investigation is rushed, biased, and potentially inaccurate, all for the sake of proving a friend's innocence, because someone has to die. This causes a clearly immoral act like murder to be set in a backdrop of an investigation that's gray. You border on the much criticized philosophy that the ends justify the means, and it gives the game a feeling of hopelessness. This feeling is even further hammered home when you start your investigations and dive into the suspect's motives, and that gray backdrop gets even more gray. When I was investigating, I was expecting to find malice, and while that is there, there's also a deep sadness that carries through every motive. In my first playthrough, I investigated Lucky. It turns out that the Baron got Lucky's daughter pregnant, and she died during the pregnancy. The Baron abused his power as a noble to sleep with Lucky's daughter and threw her away when it no longer mattered to him. This anger is perfect motive for murder, but it comes from a place of being wronged. In my second playthrough, I investigated Fenric. He was being blackmailed by the Baron to perform occult activities. Fenric could have lost his life over this alone. For every single suspect, the Baron wronged them. Sister Matilda was taken advantage of by the Baron. Otilia's husband was killed by the Baron, and she can lose her land because of it, because the Baron was a truly awful person. This depressing outlook on the Baron's potential murder is poignant, and stuck with me for a while. Such a bleak outlook on a murder isn't commonly found in games. Most murder mysteries start and stop with the complete moral bankruptcy of the murderer, and that's how deep the story goes. Murderers are often depicted as evil, and rightfully so. It's one of the vilest acts you can ever do. This makes catching them and bringing them to justice satisfying and fun. But this moral grayness in Pentiment ends up representing people's true nature more than many other games. It challenges us to see the humanity in our suspects and sympathize with why they might have wanted to get revenge. I think this game displays better than anything else that a murderer could be no worse than the common man, and maybe even better than a Baron who's gotten away with many more crimes, which is an idea that continues to humble me. It makes me wish that Andreas didn't have to be put into this situation, but wishing isn't enough for a happy ending, because Pentiment knows better than to have it all work out nicely, because life sometimes doesn't do that either. After a day and a half, your limited time is up and you have to stand before the Praetor, because somebody has to die. You have a few choices here. You can tell Praetor John about your entire investigation, or you can tell him about only 1 or 2 people, or you could just tell him nothing. Either way, a possibly innocent man or woman is going to die. If you decide to influence his decision by making correct dialogue choices, you can choose any of the suspects as long as you have enough evidence to successfully convince the Praetor to execute them. However, this naturally has consequences. I chose Lucky on my first playthrough, and Fenric on my second. On the first one, the abbot still liked me, yet Lucky's family hated me. When choosing Fenric, you no longer are welcome by the abbey. When you choose your suspect, they're executed in cold blood in front of the entire town. This execution is horrifying and graphic, and it made me feel even worse about choosing someone to throw under the bus. But in the end, Piero walks free. After the execution, you talk to Piero before you leave the town. He's declared innocent no matter who you choose, which is cause for celebration, but neither of you are very happy. Even though Piero is extremely proud of Andreas here, he's sad to say goodbye. He recognizes that Andreas' future is outside of Tassing. When showing Piero his art, Andreas finds a note that says "Do not return here" in the same script as the manipulator's pen. After this revelation, Piero expresses his thanks and wishes you well, telling you to come visit. As it turns out, Andreas never will. So far, Pentiment has been a game about solving a Baron's murder with a splash of moral gray and a few statements about human nature. This second act encapsulates why this game is truly special, because the game takes a sharp turn from solving a murder with moral ambiguity to a character study on Andreas and the people around him. It allows us to see what the passage of time holds for our characters, and to top it off, there's another murder mystery. Act 2 is my favorite act in the entire game. The tension is perfect, the time skip is well done, and the pacing is amazing. This is where the story hits its stride the strongest. The next time Andreas is in Tassing, you're visiting Piero's grave. Nearly 7 years later, this is a new Andreas in a new town. He brings an apprentice with him, named Casper, because Andreas has amassed plenty of wealth and fame based on the commissions that he has received since he left Tassing. And despite being a successful artist and having everything he could ever want, he is miserable. He is avoiding both work and his wife, because he has lost all the passion in his life, and the people around him have changed as well. After visiting Piero, Andreas runs into Otto, a friend from Act 1. It turns out you are visiting in the middle of a feud between the Abbey and the townsfolk. With rising taxes and restrictive laws, the townsfolk are planning a revolt. Otto is leading it. Relations between them have reached a boiling point and a revolution is all but guaranteed. Some are worried about the Duke's men coming in and restoring order violently, but Otto shrugs it off. Later, he gives a passionate speech that gets met with a little bit of pushback. Otto is determined that a revolt against the church's laws is just and necessary in order for the townsfolk to continue living their lives. This conflict is at the center of the second act. The church versus the townsfolk feels like a very common trope. Usually in media, the church is greedy, judgmental, and evil, and regardless if you agree with this sentiment or not, it's been done so many times before that I was worried the game would have its first cliche. But Pentiment has such good characters and is so rooted in historical events and places that the game handles the trope very well. There's no arguing that the abbot is a selfish man and the church is being unreasonable, but Pentiment's portrayal of both good people that happen to be religious and people that use their beliefs as a weapon really help with making the game feel like it's not covering familiar ground. There's so much respect for history and faith here that it feels like the original inspiration for the trope rather than just another round in a church versus the people title match that doesn't allow the player to draw its own conclusions. After running into Otto, Andreas then goes to say hi to Klaus, in what turns out to be one of my favorite interactions in the entire game. Klaus is angry at Andreas. He was close with Andreas and wrote to him in a time of need. Klaus's wife and son, who you are with and supported you in Act 1, have passed away. All that Klaus is left with is a recent daughter born just before her mother died, and Andreas never wrote Klaus back. He ignored his friend, and it's a bit unclear as to why. What follows is a very awkward conversation between the two. Klaus is looking for some sort of explanation, and Andreas doesn't really have a good one. All that he can do is either apologize, make excuses, or stay silent. After some small talk about the business and Otto's revolution, Klaus tells Andreas to come back later for dinner. I had to ponder quite a bit why this interaction between these two characters was so impactful to me. I think it has to do with radically relating to both of the characters in this conflict. At this point in the game, I finally realized that Pentiment is creating a tapestry of life. It provides situations and emotions so real and integral to the human experience. I have experienced both sides of the conflict that Andreas and Klaus are on. I've been abandoned by someone I care about when I needed them. And in some of the moments that I'm least proud of in my life, I've also abandoned those that have tried to rely on me. It's a conflict that's deeper than most, and more relatable than a lot of other stories. In an interview on the Friends Per Second podcast, director Josh Sawyer said that the big idea of this game was that people who lived in the 16th century aren't actually all that different from those that live in the 21st.
I just think people are people, and that's ultimately a big thing about Pentiment is that I want to convey is that their material reality is very different from ours. I mean, their 16th century is very far away from us in many ways, but the people of this time are not far away from us in many ways. They're really just like us. They just live in a different place in a different time.
There is such a wide range of characters, and their conflicts all feel so believable and real. People struggle with other people, trying to get food to feed their families, faith, and the changing times. For example, Kat, a local farmer, lost not only her husband, but also her infant grandson in the time Andreas was away. When you tell her you're sorry and you don't know what else to say, she simply replies, "There's not much else to say, is there?" The Gertners, the local family that hosted you in Act 1, are going through some of the hardest times financially. They can't even afford to give everyone bread at the table, and end up giving theirs to Andreas and Casper for being their guests. Paul and Else live under the tyrannical rule of Leonhardt, who is an abusive father and an absolute piece of garbage. He abuses his family, he's an adulterer, and he controls the prices of the mill selectively. He'll give discounts to women if they sleep with him. It's heartbreaking to see Paul try to hide his interest in art and cower at the thought of showing fear in front of his father. I think that the team behind this game did a fantastic job of making every single character human. You see it in everyone around you, but this extends to Andreas especially. By now, it's evident that Andreas is suffering from some severe depression, as Andreas's dreams and inner voice have transformed. Absent are the various voices of reason, passion, and virtue. Instead, Lady Beatrice has transformed into a depressive ruler named Melancholia that commands Andreas's entire psyche. Remember the mechanic that allows you to pick a member of Andreas's mind to weigh in on the current conversation? Yeah, well, that's gone. Every one of your internal dialogue choices you can make is now influenced by Melancholia, and they reek with constant self-doubt. They all lead to the same outcome. It's good representation for just how controlling and overwhelming depression can be, and it's a nice contrast to Act 1's normal brain function. When reason, virtue, and passion have either gone missing or become twisted, you're left with nothing. This is handled incredibly. Too few games are afraid to have a main character truly sink to the depths of despair, and when games do that, sometimes it's handled poorly or not explored well enough. Not here. Every scene that has Andreas speaking about himself is so incredibly well done. For example, there's an amazing scene in one of my personal favorites when he's visiting Sister Amelie, a nun that stays in Father Thomas's church. Andreas expresses how much he has lost and how it's all too much for him. Amelie's response is simply this: "Don't lose hope, Andreas. The human heart is no small thing. It can hold so much." Andreas responds in silence. There's not some sort of deep introspection that outright explains itself. Instead, it's a brief lament that you can feel, and Amelie's response is simple and elegant. And it comes before learning just how bad Andreas' mental state has become and why. Andreas had a son that died to the plague, and there was nothing that Andreas could have done. It's ruined everything: his art, his marriage, and his life. Andreas has frequent dreams about his son, and every night he gets no closer to healing. His subconscious continues to torture him, and he descends further and further into depression. This plot point is an emotional gut punch that doesn't really let you off easy. It's complemented by some great imagery. To start the dream, you are on the outside of a maze. As you navigate towards the center, your wife and son start talking to you. It's a nice touch in a gameplay moment that shows and tells. For most of the game, Andreas was lacking in emotional depth, but the building blocks for something like this were there. This act is where things start to get truly great, and things continue to change, and the game builds a great character out of Andreas. Andreas' stay continues till the Fire Festival on St. John's Eve. Back when Otto held his meeting, Otto announced plans to share some important discoveries after the festival. I wonder what happens next. It's late into the festival that Otto meets an untimely end, and it's up to you to start another investigation and find out who could have killed Otto. Due to the dire relationship between the town and the abbey, the townspeople are immediately blaming his death on the abbot. There's one problem with this: the abbot was with you at the time of Otto's death, so it was impossible for him to commit murder. You try to explain this, but nobody listens. Ignoring reason, the townspeople still call for the head of the abbot, who goes to hide in the abbey's library with all the other members. The mob threatens to burn the whole place down until you finally convince the angry mob to wait. They give you a day and a half to name Otto's killer, or they'll burn the whole abbey down. This represents a much darker turn for the game. First off, Otto's death hits a lot harder than the Baron's because of the friendship that was built throughout the game, especially if you spend so much time with him in Act 1. It's a look into the power of personal relationships in games, and by choosing to have him help with activities, I was enriching the story even further. It's too bad that the game doesn't commit to this idea more. Andreas could automatically have different reactions and cutscenes to Otto's murder, depending on how much time you spend with him. There's a bit of this earlier when you're choosing how to react to the Baron's murder, but imagine if smaller choices impacted the main narrative even more by having Andreas and Otto's friendship have a dynamic aspect. But easily the most interesting part about this situation is the sudden reversal of the moral standing the mob is in. It's hard to argue against Otto's cause being just. The wealth disparity and the pettiness of the abbot make it impossible to say that Otto was doing the wrong thing. Just look at the food between the Gertners and the abbot. And this is the abbey being in financial trouble. But Otto's followers, specifically Peter, turn barbaric when they are pushed to the point of no return. I find it impossible to side with them anymore, and it's a good lesson that how you conduct a revolution is just as important as why. They won't even back down when the Duke's men roll into town and threaten to kill every single person that stands in the way of letting the members of the abbey walk free by the next day. Regardless, there are some key differences in this new murder from the last. At first, history begins to repeat itself. There's another time limit, and there's a slew of suspects to discover with yet again no right answer. But in a stark contrast to Act 1, every one of your suspects is a liar and a cheat, and the victim was a good man. Our suspects are Hannah, Martin Bauer, and Guy. Hannah, the owner of the inn, is cheating on her husband with the owner of the mill, and Otto's revolution threatens both their businesses. Martin Bauer is an imposter and not actually who he says he is. Otto knew this and was using this information to blackmail Martin for support. If he survives till Act 3, this imposter shows his true colors by being entitled and in poor character. Guy is embezzling funds from the abbey and raising taxes. He's pocketing tons of money for himself and depositing it into a bank account in a different city. It's a far cry from Act 1, where a wronged person is pushed to their limit to make a horrible choice. This time, a person who does wrong is pushed to their limits, and the same result ensues. I think this is a purposeful contrast that's really well done. By switching the ethical dilemma, it puts an even worse light on the people of Tassing in a really dark time. The one saving grace about the past murder is that a truly awful man ended up dying, and most of the motives are somewhat understandable and maybe even just. This time, there is no silver lining. At the end of your investigation, right before the Duke's men descend onto the town to establish order, you present your findings before the angry mob, and Peter Gertner takes matters into his own hands. After Andreas reveals his choice to the mob, the suspect runs to the mill for safety, and the mob follows him or her. With the angry mob at the feet of the mill, Leonhardt shoots Ulrich in cold blood. In response, Peter and the mob burn the mill down with both the suspect and Leonhardt in it. Peter leads the mob to the abbey to tell them they have delivered justice. Instead of simply letting the abbot walk free, Peter starts a fire in the library. Ulrich was the one holding Peter together and from being too radical. Now that he's gone, Peter has nobody to stop him, and thus all hell breaks loose. With both the mill and the abbey up in flames, the Duke's soldiers have arrived and are now slaughtering any villager who fights back. Many, both man and child alike, lose their lives tonight. Here, I think we should take a moment to pause and ruin the already atrocious pacing of this video by talking about meaningful choices in games. Because as you might have noticed, two big events in this story happen regardless of what you choose: Piero's declaration of innocence and the destruction of the abbey. I think this is where video games with choices struggle. Ideally, you have to make every single possible outcome make sense, every single choice worthwhile and effective, and have a cohesive narrative that still presents what you want it to say despite letting the player choose. On top of that, you have to successfully avoid moments in the game where players want to make a certain choice, but the narrative doesn't allow for it. Furthermore, choices need to feel impactful and engaging. Considering all this, it might be an understatement to say that good choice implementation is a Herculean task that many games fail at. Oftentimes, choices in games boil down to if a character survives or not, or who your main character has a relationship with, or a shortcut to solving a problem for someone. These may feel like they offer freedom, but more often than not, they are narratively restrictive because they rob the story of significant emotional depth, whether that's by having to cover multiple outcomes, having rewards that are simply skipping a few steps of the quest, or making characters less complex. Most games with choices make me ask, what's the point of telling a specific story only for a player's agency to complicate things? I'm not saying that games with narrative choices are impossible or bad. In fact, I prefer them over ones without them, just that choices are difficult to make matter in a good way. Take Cyberpunk 2077, for example, specifically its life paths feature. Some of the narrative choices in that game have to do with your background. When making a character, you get to choose between Corporation, Street Kid, or Nomad, and on the surface, this seems great. It gives your character a unique backstory, and allows you unique dialogue options and unique missions. But its potential is squandered when most choices have to do with bypassing certain checks or just alluding to your past life. There are rarely unique and significant outcomes based on your background. No response ever feels uniquely engaging from a story perspective either. It's more of a quick quip about V's background, and then you're on to the next dialogue piece. Here, Pentiment mostly avoids these pitfalls that most games with choices have. To discuss this, let's talk about two kinds of choices: dialogue options that express character, and decisions that change a character's life. Pentiment excels and struggles with each of these to an extent. For dialogue options, Pentiment is stronger than almost any other game. Where it does a great job is the ability for your choices to always feel like they are authentic. Your background will often produce significant dialogue options that impact how characters might respond. What Pentiment does well is that these personality traits are not always desirable. My logic and law background on my second playthrough got me into a bit of trouble when I would break out technicalities and and logical fallacies. What this led to was rarely ever using them in dialogue because none of the responses for these two dialogue options ever produced a desirable result. I think I clicked on law only 2 or 3 times because it wasn't helpful to the conversation. This purposeful choice to make dialogue options vary in consequence is mostly well done and one of Pentiment's biggest strengths. It makes you think critically on what you say, which is great, but I just wish that some background's positives were a bit more relevant to practical conversation. This means that not every background is as engaging, and that means that you're just out of luck if you choose a background with more negative or impractical responses in conversations. As far as major narrative variations, this is where Pentiment starts to get a little dicey. If we call major narrative decisions big choices, then there would be none in this game. Even your suspects that you choose to execute only change the surrounding narratives. And let's call those surrounding narratives, their choices and their consequences, small choices. These smaller choices have many different outcomes, like if a friend gets married or not, or if someone hates your guts. So many smaller choices, and having 0 big choices, makes the game feel like you can control some outcomes, but not every single outcome. Many people can be frustrated with this, as it makes the game feel very selective in what you can change, and I think there's something to that. Obviously, you can't give your player complete control and utter freedom, because that would prevent you from telling any sort of story, ever. But there are a few choices that you can add that might help with this conflicted feeling. In other words, there's a clear separation between a fixed narrative that is being told and a bunch of amazing side stories that can turn out in a lot of ways. Earlier, Andreas never wrote back. If it was up to me, Andreas would have written. In a game all about choices, Andreas' depreciation of a friendship here feels a bit cheap, because I was given the illusion that I was making choices in Act 1 to maintain a friendship. This wouldn't be a problem if there weren't so many other similar choices that you make throughout Act 1 that have as major of an effect as this would theoretically have. Plus, when you have so many different outcomes for how things turn out, and you can't control anything to do with Piero, or Klaus, or Father Thomas, or even Peter, it starts to feel like your immersion is breaking a bit. This makes it feel like a lot of other characters you can impact in some way outside of the main story. In other words, some of the most important characters feel oddly sidelined. Having the main narrative slightly change is the ideal outcome here, and a good way to fix this problem. But if you want to avoid that, a good alternative is giving some characters that are featured prominently in the main narrative a little leeway to have these smaller details variate. In Act 1, if you suck up to the Baron, he can give you a pin to wear. This pin does nothing, but the outcome here allows for a bit of a personal flavor, reflecting Andreas' choices with the Baron. I'm honestly a bit floored that they didn't do this with more characters that you can't avoid talking to. Maybe if you were given the option to write Klaus back, the outcome is that he is sadder and mourns with Andreas instead of being mad at him. Or maybe even trying to write back, but having Melancholia take over to convince you not to would be even more impactful and contribute to the feeling of losing your life to depression. So theoretically, you can still have these smaller details affect Thomas, Peter, or Klaus while keeping their important roles in the story intact. Smaller choices that come from smaller details can seem easy to criticize, but I actually think Pentiment does this really well. How often have you heard a criticism that a certain choice in a game will only get you some minor extra credits with a very slightly different narrative outcome? Pentiment sidesteps this by being a narrative-only game. There are no other ways to give a reward, so it's impossible to get a reward that you don't care about. That is, unless you're not interested in the story, which makes no sense why you would still be playing. This is why I say that Pentiment kind of gets away with not having major narrative branches. The value of these small choices working out makes you forget about how many plot points are set in stone. Basically, the major reward for choices are more character moments that just work. My favorite example of a small choice that has little consequence but feels significant is encouraging Brother Rudiger to sing in the library if you check on the members of the Abbey in Act 2. Doing this has no significant outcome on if the library goes up in flames or not, and it doesn't even get you closer to solving a murder, or it doesn't even change a character's fate. It's also very easily missed, as I didn't even think to enter the library in Act 2 on my first playthrough. But what does happen is a neat scene that conveys a sense of peace in a time of violence. I felt great about it because it was such a small and meaningful moment where I was able to do something little to inspire courage in the hearts of people who were really scared.
Christe eleison, Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison.
While I am criticizing Pentiment for how it tries to combine a strong overarching narrative with tons of little choices with various outcomes, I'm glad that this tension exists. It may sound like I just contradicted myself, but I think the easy way to solve this criticism is just to remove the smaller outcomes and choices. But if the game didn't have these small choices or differences in outcomes, it would be a much worse off game. I can only imagine Pentiment with no choices. It would lose so much of its narrative power by choosing a suspect for you or having a canon killer the entire time. Plus, I strongly believe that seeing how different characters react on different playthroughs gives the game depth and replayability. That experience of choice is paramount, and that's going to show even more as we move from Act 2 to Act 3. With the Abbey in flames, Andreas makes the decision to try and save whatever little is left of the library. He runs into the flames and we see his silhouette collapse in the fire. In response to the burning of the mill and now the Abbey, the Duke's men have come to establish law and order. A massive fight breaks out as many revolting peasants lose their lives in a massacre of the people of Tassing. Act 2 ends with a shot of Klaus fleeing the hellish battlefield with his only daughter in his arms. The game pronounces Andreas as dead, and the screen fades to black. This narrative direction is shocking and really well done, but it's a shame that we then move from my favorite part of the game to my least favorite part of the game. The third and final act of this game starts, and it's the most contentious and, in my opinion, the weakest one. On paper, it should be my favorite act, but there are quite a few problems with its execution that make it fall short of high expectations. If Act 2 was a masterclass in picking apart a man who has lost everything, Act 3 is a very flawed attempt to wrap up a great story that's been weaved throughout multiple time periods. There is still plenty of good to be found in here though. You pick up years later as Magdalene, the daughter of Klaus. Andreas and that fateful night have become a distant memory. You're now in your early 20s, helping your father with the printing press. Your father is going to make a mural of Tassing's history to display in the town hall, and the members of the local town council and Father Thomas are debating what should be on another person's work of art. This third and final act is all about this piece, but before we get to more recap, let's talk about pacing. Every story has a pace at which it's told, and it's one of the most key aspects to effective storytelling. A story with a poor pace makes it easier to spot other flaws, while something with a faster pace hides those flaws a bit better. But pacing is more than just hiding flaws. It's about keeping your audience engaged and your story high quality. This is especially difficult in video games, where most games have a strong presence of both gameplay and story. Almost every game has an ebb and a flow of times where the story moves along faster or slower, and sometimes the gameplay is even faster or slower. But too much fast or slow from either of these areas and things start to get a bit rocky, as too little or too many details can derail a good plot, or too many enemies or too little challenges to overcome and the game gets boring. Pentiment only has a story to rely on, which makes things a lot simpler, and yet Pentiment still fails in its pacing at the start of the third act, which means that it tests the player's attention while showing some faults of its own. When your story makes a massive time jump and doesn't directly pick up from where you left off, that's going to come with some negatives. I'm going to be honest, Magdalene isn't Andreas. She grew on me, but the loss of our beloved character that we spent 10 hours with leaves a little bit of a hole that Magdalene can't fill. It's like starting from the top with Andreas, even down to picking new skills. It's a huge momentum reset. Momentum is hard to put into words, and I think it's really important for games. When the game's pacing speeds up, it's hard to justify the story slowing down again because you just want to go fast. It can work, especially if there's a narrative pattern or a hook that follows the slower pace, but it doesn't work that well here. Part of the problem is that it's combined with switching to a new protagonist without a sense of finality. It doesn't help that the previous act isn't a terribly compelling cliffhanger. The shock that I experienced quickly turned to disappointment when I learned that I had to play plenty more to get my answers. All these aren't problems by themselves, but combine them all and you get a recipe for what I did on my first playthrough, which was go through the act as fast as humanly possible. Admittedly, this is the wrong way to play this game. I wanted to see where the story was headed, and my impatience caused me to miss a lot on my first playthrough. And when you want to plow forward and figure out where the story might lead because the main character just bit the dust, it was easy for me to miss the forest for the trees. Maybe this is just a me problem, but the only solution to this was for me to literally take a break from playing and come back later when I had the patience to actually explore and have optional conversations. If a game has to be put down for a while in order for me to grin and bear the rest of the game, I don't think that's a good thing. thing. What's funny is that Act 3 is not short of those authentic human moments that make the game so special. You get to see the effects of the revolt, good and bad. You get to see people show their true colors. You can see how 2 former Abbey members have made a life for themselves. You can witness a father and a daughter remember their dead family members and mourn them. Some of my favorite conversations come from characters you have to go out of your way to visit, or you can miss some amazing dialogue entirely. And that's why the sudden slow pace is so damaging in this act, and the pace doesn't get much better as we move forward. After a disagreement about what should go on the town's mural, you both head home and go to bed. Earlier, Magdalene found a note written in fancy script that said, "Stop." It's the same handwriting from the person who is leaving notes trying to get our many suspects to kill the earlier victims. It's no surprise then that later that night, Klaus is attacked by a stranger. He suffers severe trauma and is given mere months to live. After much deliberation, it is now up to you to finish your father's mural. The next 2 or so hours of this game is interviewing people about different accounts of the history of Tassing. You talk to various people for research, and after learning what they have to say, you get to decide how to portray Tassing's early Roman history, its Christian history, and the night of the revolt. It's somewhat important to get a good grasp on the history of the town in order to understand the twist later on, so buckle up. This part is just super slow compared to Act 2, and I don't care as much about the history as I do the characters. There's really only a few points that stand out here and are worth mentioning. First is the fact that someone is following you throughout this entire segment, and this is the main draw of suspense for the entirety of the 2.5-hour history lesson. It's spread out a bit too thin to be effective, but it is still worth mentioning. But if we put the suspense and mystery to the side, I have 2 favorite parts during this section. One, talking to different characters and seeing the effect that Andreas, directly or indirectly, has had on the people of Tassing, and 2, the heartfelt conversations between Klaus and Magdalene that happen over time. For everything related to Andreas, it's really satisfying to talk or write to old characters from Andreas' story and see where they are now and how they thought of Andreas. It's a nice change from hearing hearsay about any suspects and investigating murders, even if it is significantly less thrilling and goes on for too long. Klaus's relationship with his daughter is also explored over time. Other characters can sometimes weigh in on his health and wish him or you well, even if things aren't looking good. This sincere yet naive optimism from friends hits a bit too close to home. Overall, this plot point sets up some great emotional moments later. At this point though, you're along for a ride that's traveling a little slower than you would like. Things finally pick up when it's Christmas Eve. After researching all 3 time periods, you go to a Christmas celebration at the inn. The entire town is here, and the little scene that plays out is bittersweet. It's just people enjoying good drinks, good food, and each other's company. There's no denying that so many things are going wrong all around them, but it also shows how characters can find joy in a time where so many things are worse than they once were. Some things did get better, but life is still hard for many, which makes their ability to enjoy life even more impactful. After the celebration, Maggie comes home to say hi to her father. They have a heartfelt conversation about not having much time left and how love is the only thing worth pursuing in this world. When Magdalene goes down to get some food, it's revealed that somebody else is there with you. It turns out this person that has been following you is Andreas Muller. He explains that he never died in that fire. He's been hiding for years, desperately trying to crack the mystery that he hasn't been able to solve. And despite slowly losing his mind, he's been following you to try to keep you safe. His security methods may not be optimal, but at this point you need to put the past behind you and find the real mastermind behind this whole thing, because Andreas knows exactly where to start looking. Andreas leads her to an underground passageway that he's finally located after all these years. It's an old Roman ruin beneath Tassing. On the way there, we switch to controlling Andreas and we experience my favorite scene in this game. You start by leaving Magdalene behind and begin walking through a corridor. It begins to fill with visions of all the people that died by your hand, as they mock you and tease you for causing their deaths. When you finally get to the end of the hallway, you are back in Andreas's dreams. Andreas has lost his mind and needs to piece it back together. What follows is a journey to escape the maze of his mind while giving closure to the pain and suffering that Andreas has gone through. I was worried that his death would mean that all of his character development was for naught, but that's not so. And I'm glad, because this scene made me cry on both playthroughs, and when I play the game again, I'm sure the tears are gonna flow. It has some of the most impactful and emotional dialogue in the entire game. Andreas talks to 3 people: his wife that he left, his apprentice that sacrificed himself to save Andreas from that fire, and his son that he lost. He comes to a resolution and a closure with each of them. They tell him not to blame himself and to look outside of his own mind to help others. The dialogue here is masterful, and it reminded me of how much of a strong character Andreas has become. With a determination to look outward instead of inward, Andreas escapes his mind successfully. He lands back in reality, face to face with Sister Amelie. Magdalene runs and catches up with Andreas, and they're also greeted by Father Thomas. It turns out that Sister Amelie, the nun that Father Thomas was keeping in the church, was writing the notes to the suspects. She was doing this by instruction of Father Thomas. He says that she doesn't know any better, and he was the one that told her what to write. He did this all because the Baron and Otto both learned that the statues around Tassing aren't Christian saints. They are Roman gods, and the Christian saints that people revere so much are most likely myth. He even admits to killing the prior abbot before Andreas's arrival. Father Thomas was willing to kill to protect the truth, which he believed would protect people's salvation. He thought that this truth would shake the town's faith to its core, and by keeping the myth of these saints afloat, he was actively saving the souls of many. Think of Plato's noble lie, but for Christian faith. This is the big twist of the game, and on paper, it's a great twist. On my second playthrough, I noticed that the clues are right in front of you the whole entire time, and from the beginning. Father Thomas will have a negative reaction when the Baron mentions Historia Tassae, the book that explains Roman history in Act 1. Sister Illuminata, when asked about the book, is suspicious of its contents. The tales of St. Moritz you can learn about are a bit far-fetched, and Andreas can express his doubt the more you pry into them. In Act 2, Otto can outright say that he found the saint's head right before his murder. In Act 3, if you choose to be an expert in current theological debates, Magdalene will mention that Martin Luther is hypercritical of the church for creating impossible stories about saints. I'm sure that there are more that I missed. Some murder mystery games have twists that are impossible to predict because it withholds the information from you. The story doesn't play fair by giving you none of the tools to solve it. Instead, you're just along for the ride. This isn't inherently a bad thing, but part of the fun of mystery games is catching on before you're supposed to, and the games that make it impossible to guess the answer feel less satisfying to play. This game is not one of them, and that makes it a good twist. But while I respect the twist, and there is certainly much to learn from it from a moral perspective, ultimately I don't care that much about it, because most of my investment is no longer involved in the truth of what is happening. The game sets this standard itself with the unresolved murders of the Baron and Otto. My investment has instead turned to the characters around me. Andreas' journey is impactful. Klaus's inevitable death is emotional. The tragedies of the people around me that are completely unrelated are meaningful. And while it is interesting and makes narrative sense why Father Thomas does what he does, I don't really care as much as I should. In fact, the care that I do have is for Sister Amelie and her abuse, not the fact that the truth about Christian figures is that they come from Roman legends. The idea here is that this is such a small and petty thing to kill over. I think it's easy to view Thomas as having too much faith in the Christian God, but I disagree. He has too little. If he had more faith, a false depiction of an inspiring saint wouldn't mean much. Throughout the entire game, every peasant and common folk has been saying to trust in Providence. Thomas does not do this. His lack of faith in the Christian people, and in my opinion, God, is heartbreaking, which leads us to the main moral of the story. Information and knowledge is important when controlling how a group thinks. When you are able to create a simple narrative that changes significant facts of a portion of events, it blurs an entire story. Thomas is holding on to an illusion under the false pretense that this would help more people believe, and he was willing to kill for it. This moral transparency in a power structure is seen not only in the final reveal, but in the murder mystery as well. Thomas's notes fooled Andreas for the longest time, creating a story so that Thomas can lurk in the shadows. Overall, it's a good message that is applicable to today, but I think the moral is less effective than it could be because of how isolated it is. We don't see how the behavior of the people around us is affected by an overt faith in the saints. All of our characters' behavior is reacting to murders or higher taxes. These murders are Thomas's behavior, but the truth that he is trying to protect isn't causing any direct harm or necessarily any good. We see how faith plays a role in people's lives, but we don't often see how important the false saints are to people's faith. I can't even come up with an example where someone's faith was strengthened because of the legend, other than 2 side conversations that weren't even integral to the characters' stories. What this causes is a story where the characters' lives and what happens in them overshadow the main message of the story. That's not necessarily something to complain about, it's just sad that they're not related just a bit more. Imagine how heartbreaking it would be if Thomas's motivation doesn't just lead to murder, it deceives and causes significant harm directly to the people's faith and their families. I think the game could have made these saints more important to the people if it wanted to be truly effective. After Father Thomas is done explaining his motives, he decides that he does not have the will or the means to kill either Magdalene or Andreas. Father Thomas ends up trying to bury the underground Roman ruins in a heap of rubble, causing the church that it stands on to collapse. He loses his life in the process. You take Amelie and run for it, leaving Thomas to rot in a heap of rubble. After leaving, you are given a choice. Tell the people of Tassing the truth, or continue to hide the fact that the Saints aren't real. Either way you choose, it has little to no effect on the ending. You head back up to the surface to Klaus, and to tell him what you discovered and who was really behind all these murders, as well as the secret that Thomas was so eager to protect. Halfway through your explanation, Klaus dies. Pentiment ends with Magdalene leaving Tassing, and Andreas staying behind to teach a younger generation of kids how to draw. In the end, we see a mural that has most of our choices and their consequences throughout the game up for display. It's painted by one of the kids that Andreas taught. The book on Pentiment closes. As it turns out, you have been playing the game in a book written by Sister Amelie telling the truth of all that happened. This explains the unique art style and the certain menus that pop up, as they all revolve around a book format. The credits then roll. Overall, this ending was generally well done, especially with Klaus's death. He became a character that I grew fond of, and the relationship with his daughter is really well done. But I do have a complaint. It's that we don't see the individual consequences of exposing the truth or not. Earlier, I talked about how, for the most part, Pentiment gets away with not having multiple main story branches. Part of this is because somebody is trying to control many things that happen. Now that you are no longer manipulated by somebody pulling the strings, having a big story choice with little to no difference in how it plays out feels cheap. It conflicts with the idea that we are suddenly given a choice in the matter, which should give us a sense of control over the future. Instead, our characters question if it was all for naught. By having this choice not play a very big role in our characters' lives, it cheapens the overall message and makes this choice feel inconsequential. Pentiment doesn't stick the landing quite right, but I think focusing on this aspect is beside the point. Its third act has just as many emotional pieces as the first two acts, if not more, and while I wasn't a fan of the implementation of the twist, it was still logical, and for the most part, well done. Overall, Pentiment's strengths are just as present in the game's closing chapter. It's just that the game's weaknesses shine a bit brighter due to poor pacing and a lack of emotional investment in our characters for a good portion of the final act. I think that if I were to summarize Pentiment, I can only say that it was about a man escaping his own mind and coming to terms with life. It's something that everybody must do, and that fact is reflected in the world built around him. Throughout this entire game, we have seen characters have the most tragic and awful things happen to them. Eva loses her husband to murder. Children and spouses pass away unexpectedly. People are abused and taken advantage of. Loved ones are unexpectedly lost. Many people are left with so very little. Yet good things happen too, and those good things can come from a whole lot of bad. And that makes this story so much more impactful, because it shows how people and things truly are, and few games pull that off. There's a murder mystery in this game, and honestly, I don't care for it all that much. It's true that I love the way that the murder's consequences force us to dive deeper into the characters affected. Plus, it's a solid mystery that makes sense, and that you can see coming if you pay close enough attention, which is honestly pretty rare. The big reveal isn't even that bad. It just lacks compared to what makes the game special. Even if you shove the debate about choices in video games aside, there's some significant problems. Pacing bogs down the third act, there's no chapter, select, or manual saves, and for a series of murders that feel so connected to the town's history, the motivations behind them feel a bit disconnected from the town's people. And that's what I love. The people of this small town. To make this video, I played this game twice fully, and some replays of Act 1 for some extra footage. To see everything and fully invest myself in the residents of Tassing, I feel like I had to play the game at least 3 or 4 more times. There are so many ways that this game can play out, and if you miss one little detail, you miss changing a small section of an entire playthrough. And to the game's credit, it's something that the game does really well. At only 12 to 15 hours per run, I want to go back through and do it all over again. If you watched this video without playing the game, I left out a ton of things to experience and small choices to make. I did this partially on purpose because I know some people might want to play the game now after watching this video, and partially not on purpose because I probably just missed some really good optional content. There is so much that I didn't get to experience that I hope you will. I would highly recommend playing it for yourself, and if you already have played it, you might want to just play it again. In the end, Pentiment is incredible, and I can end this video by saying how great a game it is, but I think I've already beaten that into the ground. Many others have beaten that into the ground as well. Instead, I'll say this: most games should be like Pentiment, because Pentiment doesn't shy away from what makes life so hard. More games should meet reality with full force, with stories that reflect both the best and the worst in humans, because these humans are what make Pentiment truly special. There's an authenticity to Pentiment that not many other games have. The few games that do are often considered to have some of the best stories in gaming, and Pentiment, in almost every way I can think of, is no exception.